Lovely. Okay, so I don't think we have anyone new with us, so we don't have any orientation that we will do. So we'll just move right now to our next panel on Shannon Mariotti's Contemplative Democracy. And Shannon or Anita, if you guys want to spotlight or Shannon, if you can spotlight yourselves, since I don't have well, I can figure it out, but I'll let you do it. So yeah, Shannon is professor of political science at Trinity University in San Antonio. And we'll start the panel hearing from Sokthan Yeng and then David McMahan. Sokthan is a professor of philosophy at Adelphi University in Garden City, New York, and she's the author of Buddhist Feminism, Transforming Anger Against Patriarchy, which is a book that we featured at our last event, which was 3 years ago now, which is hard to believe the stormy waves of time. And then David, of course, is Charles A. Dana Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College, and of course, the author of Rethinking Meditation from our last panel. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Sokthan to start us off on Shannon's wonderful book.
Thank you. I just want to thank you again for inviting me, and just to be part of this community has been amazing. I am in philosophy, so it's something that David had said earlier, if I may, was really resonated with me because I had talked about your book and about Buddhist modernism at a philosophy conference, which is normal for me. And then at the comment section, they said, well, nobody uses that term unless they're criticizing them. I thought, oh, I never really thought that way. That's really odd. Okay. And it was only until I actually joined this group that I realized that Theravada Buddhism had some traction in America, as crazy as it is, because in philosophy, it's so oriented towards Mahayana Buddhism. I never thought people even touched it. I thought it was really just the realm of anthropologists and religious studies people. So just being part of this group has also put me more in touch with my heritage. I'm Cambodian by birth, so I'm of a Theravada tradition. But also, I just really, again, want to thank Shannon. I met her, I don't know, it just seems like so long ago now in Oklahoma City, and our partnership has just been so fruitful for me to hear about this. And I will say that reading your book, I felt a little bit triggered because I'm going through some type of shared governance thing too, and I was trying to channel it to say like, what would the circle school people do? What can we do? So I really think it was pressing my buttons in I think some interesting ways, and hopefully, but I sort of took that part out of the paper, but we can maybe revisit it because I do need help, afterwards. Okay, so without further ado, I'll start. Contemplative democracy, politics, practice, and pedagogy opens with a concrete example of the ways members of the Circle School promoted contemplative practice in the hopes of creating a democratic space that in turn supported the school. Although Mariotti lets other members of the Circle School shine, it is clear that she's integrated many lessons of the Circle School into her work. Teachers at the Circle School begin the day by sharing stories from different cultures around the globe. Mariotti, too, highlights the ways that decolonial feminists and Buddhist traditions have helped her think through her project that builds on contemplative practice. Mariotti uses the metaphor of a container to explain contemplative praxis. With the help of Gloria Anzaldúa, she creates a non-dualistic conception of a container. The container is both something that limits and allows growth. In one sense, containers belong with the settled rigidity, comfortable complacency, and even oppressive rules. She writes, home is a space of boundaries, categories, containers, disciplines, unitary identity, end quote. Containers allow us to see the lines that separate, even if such a separation forms precisely through the containment of one discipline over and against another. Certainly, the establishment of categories can create hostility and divisions in the hopes of cementing moving borders. Anzaldúa provides a decolonial feminist perspective that complicates accepted categories. For her, home was always also a space of homelessness. Colonial containers have separated a people through boundaries when they did not exist before. The boundary between Texas and Mexico existed on a map and was reinforced through colonialism, but they continue to dance within her. The creation of categories also requires the surveillance and maintenance of divisions. Anzaldúa does not fit neatly into categories. Although others wanted to tame her wild tongue, she refused to give up her Spanglish or Chicano language. Still others wanted her to forget or disown either her indigenous or white heritage. Anzaldúa understood that she belonged to many traditions. As a queer activist, she fought against heteropatriarchy. Her response to those who wanted to place her in one category was to blur the lines that created distinct identities. Nzaldua used her story as an example of a life that would not be contained. She represents identities that are ready to burst and rupture artificial boundaries. The curve and shape of disrupted spaces are unknown. Mariotti explains that democracy, too, contains this element of unknowability, but also of emptiness. The container is therefore also a space of potential. That which is contained always threatens to erupt and overflow the container. The famous Taoist symbol of yin and yang expresses the idea that nothing is completely distinct or separate. Everything contains something that is other. In similar fashion, the Buddhist attempt to challenge dualistic thinking can be seen in the concept of emptiness. Thich Nhat Hanh, by explaining emptiness through interbeing, demonstrates that there cannot be this without that. Categories such as right and left are meaningless without the other. The deep connection between concepts and objects appears when we are able to understand what emptiness is. Emptiness is not the absence of meaning, but rather the affirmation that everything is connected. What we will become depends on the ever-changing conditions that flow together like streams toward the river of life. We are not individuated, self-contained beings. With a nod to the potentiality of contemplative democracy, Mariotti notes that there is a value in remembering to approach things with beginner's mind, being open to the complexity of life as it unfolds in front of us in ways that always exceed our containers and categories. Democracy can be messy. Contemplative democracy allows us to embrace not knowing. Often the assumptions that create strict categories get in the way of understanding. The belief that we know what one thing is, or that we should try to anticipate how the opposing side will respond, may cloud our ability to see what we think is radically different from ourselves. Or perhaps we have an idea that we know what will solve the problem. Through Mariotti's work with the Circle School, she passes along advice that members of the co-op have learned through their own experience. I was struck by the pithy remark, empathize, don't fix. It seems so simple and so right, but so difficult. When we listen to others, it can be a challenge to listen deeply, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say. When we listen deeply, we are there with the person and extending our empathy. We cannot do this if we are listening to find a solution. If we are listening in order to tell the person what to do to fix their problems, we are often not attentive to the pain or struggle that the person is trying to convey. Our mind may be racing towards a lecture, what they have done wrong, what they could have done better, or towards blaming some other. Empathize, don't fix, emphasizes what should be at the forefront while also providing a clear warning against our own vanity. How can we know what will fix the issue? We have not listened enough to know the situation. What makes us think that the person confiding in us wants us to fix the problem or thinks we are capable of fixing the problem? It is much more likely that we cannot fix the problem. We can, however, listen and empathize. Of course, this takes some thought and effort. Although the container can limit as it works to contain its contents, Mariotti also notes the ways that a container can help nurture growth. The serene monk sitting quietly often serves as a mascot for mindful meditation practice. Sitting in quiet meditation for an extended period of time, however, can be challenging for many. It requires patience and practice. This practice container may seem too rigid for some. Others who Mariotti interviewed focused on somatic movement and conscious dance as a means to shape their contemplative practice. Moving consciously is another form of meditation that can help us become more aware of our bodily actions. As Nhat Hanh points out, meditation and awareness need not happen outside the bounds of our regular lives. Washing dishes can be meditative if we wash dishes just to wash dishes. Although the goal is to be present in every moment of our lives, this perspective does not come automatically. It requires practice, and that practice often begins with setting aside some time for a particular activity. Sitting, dancing, or washing dishes can work as a container for our practice. To that end, Mariotti points to the importance of the container to help improve ourselves and our community. She writes, meaningful democracy depends upon a certain way of experiencing the world around us, but those modes of experience need a container where they can be cultivated, end quote. Meaningful democracy may seem to be a goal that is further and further out of reach in the current US or global political system. A container, precisely because it sets some bounds, can help us to cultivate a mindful perspective and focus on contemplative practice. Finding containers for contemplative practice, of course, is much more manageable than tackling the threat to democracy worldwide. Yet the path to meaningful democracy is difficult to see unless we can find particular containers to practice skills such as empathizing and listening to others and ourselves. I'm reminded of a Taoist story about a wealthy man who admires a house with a beautiful view from the third floor. He contacts the mason who built the house so that he can have the same view from the third floor. After the construction begins, the wealthy man visits the site and is upset to find that the mason is building a foundation for the house. He only wants the third floor. Patiently, the mason has to tell the wealthy man that the third floor cannot exist without first creating a base and then building the second floor. Only after these floors are complete can he build the third floor that will give him the beautiful view. Containers and foundations for contemplative practice are necessary to build before we can have beautiful views and meaningful democracy. I return again to the container that Mariotti places at the forefront of her monograph, The Circle School. Contemplative democracy works to incorporate contemplative practices into political action in order to bolster a sense of what we have in common. The common speaks to what we share and the notion that everyone can and should take part in the governance process. In an era when the idea that the emphasis on diversity has created too much division, the Circle School provides concrete examples of the benefits of a multicultural approach to teaching. Children begin the day with activities meant to connect members of the community. They sit in a circle, often with a parent who drops the child off at school. The circle provides a space for children and parents to interact with some frequency. Seeing each other with their families, although a seemingly small gesture, marks their departure for many of us. Some schools are set up so that children walk to a bus stop on their own. Others arrange for a lineup of cars to drop students off. One parent may only see other parents through the rearview mirror of their cars. The Circle School, in contrast, encourages greater interaction and emphasizes something literally building the community. Some parents help maintain the building, others help to secure funding through grant writing. Everyone has a voice at meetings to discuss how best to educate their children. In the past few years, the media has provided many sound bites and clips of angry parents shouting at administrators and each other at school board meetings. I can imagine that some of these parents have never seen each other before, maybe have no idea who their children are. Although the Circle School is not a utopia free of conflict, it also makes sense that seeing other parents on a regular basis interacting with their children in a loving manner can help reduce tensions when disagreements arise. It is more difficult to demonize another person if one can recall positive experiences sitting together. It is easier to recognize their humanity when one's first encounter with another parent is not a contentious school board meeting. Although disagreements do arise among parents, no one who stays within the Circle School objects to the sharing of folk tales from various cultures. These stories introduce children to other ways of thinking about society and often highlight the importance of nature and the role of the feminine. There seems to be no indication that straying from the white Western canon of literature is controversial. I see in my college students that they still love hearing stories. They remain a wonderful vehicle for relaying philosophy and life lessons. However, many students admit that they don't know any stories from other cultures. I did this recently, and I would say 9/10 of them had no other ideas of what other stories they could talk about. When I asked them to tell the class their favorite story, many students relay the plot of a Disney movie. The Walt Disney Corporation has shaped one of the few things that many students have in common. They seem genuinely sad that they can't recall a story from another culture. Most seem to think that stories from other cultures would not detract from their sense of self, but would have, to the contrary, given them a glimpse of the lives of others. After a few critical readings about Disney movies, many of the students can see that Disney movies fall short of multicultural ideals while succeeding at capturing the market share for children's stories. They struggle, as do I, with a greater question. How do we find and create stories that help us break with white supremacist capitalist patriarchy? How can we work together towards this goal? I think I'm running a little long. So I'll also just say the other question that I had that came from reading Shannon's book, which I read multiple times and enjoyed each time, is just to ask, can we do this? How can we create this community? How can we create contemplative practice with something that's already existing? So the Circle School, I think, is new. It's a free of accreditation requirements. It's built sort of on a model of, I think, I can't remember what it's called. I want to say BlackRock. I can't, of another school that was also somehow built from the ground up. And I did see that Shannon was also saying, well, we can do this from our own lives. So she talks about how every day in her classes, she begins, like we did today, with a grounding meditation, and how we can build sort of out from that type of practice. And I have tried to incorporate that too. I've sort of done it on both ends. I've done it in the beginning, but I've also given the students that space in the end. And they have come back and said that they feel much more relaxed and centered and be able to go on with their day. And so I do think that that is something that we can take as a container for our practice, even if it's just 2 minutes of the day. So I will end there, and I want to thank Shannon for providing those also critical practical skills for us as teachers.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sokthan. So yeah, gonna pass things over to David now. Sorry, David, you're yeah.
Yeah. All right. Everybody hear me now? Okay. So first, thanks so much to Shannon for writing such a thought-provoking book that is probably more relevant and timely today even than it was when she was writing it. As important as the question of how to enact democracy in the world has been for the last couple centuries at least, it's obviously attained a new sense of urgency today. So, the overall argument of Shannon's book is that contemplative practices provide the methods that can help cultivate individuals with democratic sensibilities, with the implication that that in turn will help create more democratic societies. It lays out a compelling vision of how such practices can be braided together with democratic action on a larger scale, how they can foster attitudes and motivations toward social change, how they can help to cultivate people's capacities to enact democracy on individual, family, communal, uh, national, and international scales. I want to zero in on one of the recurring themes of the book, kind of leitmotif, and it's the idea that both contemplative practices and democratic ways of being disrupt the logic of ordinary perception, thought, feeling that are given to us by our societies, that they involve a kind of reconfiguration of perceptions through the disruption of default intuitions set up by social systems. Um, and I thought I would just read a little passage that I think illustrates that. There's a number of places where that overall point is summarized. This one has to do with care workers, and it's on page 163. Contemplative practices can work as an important supplement and support to the realization of the caring democracy in several ways. Meditative practices can be part of the dislocation of our default modes of perception that help us see care work and see the value of care workers, while also being a place that makes us more attentive to others, more compassionate, and better at that care work that that we now understand is part of the work of ordinary democracy. It is predicted that meditating in this way will generate greater compassion for others because when you let go of attachment to desires, interests, passions, and fears, you can move beyond yourself and connect with others. Contemplative practices can also cultivate a sense of our own interdependence, our own vulnerability, our own complexity. They can help us see ourselves as complexly hybrid and not one, not the other, non-dualistically. Uh, so I think that's a nice pithy summary of some of the ways in which um, Shannon sees these contemplative practices as infusing everyday life. So one of my questions when I grappled with my own book is to what extent we should see meditation as naturally conducive to producing these senses of self and world, these values, these affective inclinations, these what Shannon calls democratic moments, and so on. Or is it something that can simply be used to help cultivate them in the same way they might be used to help cultivate other very different values? I guess another way to put it is how contingent do you see the relationship between meditation and democracy? Do you see that, do you think that meditation naturally gives rise to these characteristics, or is it more instrumental to achieving them? I anticipate your answer to that question, but it's something we might talk about. So this relates to a way that the book construes two approaches to democracy, to the modernist tradition and the romantic tradition, which I've talked about in some of my work as well. Um, so the romantic approach to both democracy and meditation would be, she quotes Charles Taylor here, the romantic epiphany will free us from the debased mechanistic world and brings to light the spiritual reality behind nature and uncorrupted human feeling. So it involves accessing a kind of deeper, more authentic reality within the mind. It emphasizes human beings as having interior depths and passions in contrast to the sort of superficial social masks that we have to wear. And the modernist approach, in contrast, is skeptical about a deeper reality and focuses on reframing everyday reality to see the dimensions hidden by dominant social structures. It strives to, quote, create moments of awakening in ordinary life when we are briefly shaken out of our mechanized existence. Um, so one of the things that I ended up sort of concluding in my book, and I just like to still work through it a little bit because you know how it is when you publish something and you're like, oh, I really committed myself to that position. Do I really believe it now? But I basically am inclined to think that there's no guarantee that meditation in and of itself will naturally lead to uh, a particular political orientation or even necessarily a compassionate way of being, a radical egalitarianism, or a felt sense of democracy. And in part, that's because I'm a historian of religion. And we know from history, for example, that, say, Zen and various other Buddhist priests trained kamikaze pilots and supported Japanese imperialism and militarism during the war. And that's just one chapter in the history of Buddhist and meditative traditions supporting imperial monarchical regimes, devotion to emperors, collusion with hierarchical, patriarchal, misogynistic, and aristocratic institutions. So there's just a broad variety in which meditation, a context in which meditation occurs. And I have a lot of sympathy with Shannon's sort of disruption and novel insight model of meditation. It's one that I talk about a lot in my own book, and I'm struck by the overlaps, which were really cool to see. Um, there's also a couple of things that left me wondering about that model, even though it's one that I embraced for the book. I mentioned some other possible ways of construing it. For instance, Shannon talks about the metaphor of leaving home in Buddhism, which often means joining the monastic community. And in that sense, when you're leaving home, you're leaving, the ideological, social, familial, often political structures of kind of the home, broadly construed, and adopting a completely different way of being. And yet, in some ways, this can be often far more strict and rigid and controlled, and sometimes more hierarchical than home life. One of the paradoxes of Zen, one of the many, is that rhetorically, at least in some of its literature, it's irreverent, iconoclastic, free from the bounds of etiquette and rigid social behaviors. Uh, my students always like the quote by Linji, uh, not just that if you see the Buddha, kill the Buddha, but also he has a quote where he says something like, Zen is not about anything special. Just eat, shit, piss, and put on your robes and go to sleep when you're tired. So, and so, yet, life in the Zen monastery, especially in Japan or Korea, is as rigid as life in any military unit. Every movement, every step, every bite is not just done mindfully, but in accordance with strict protocols. And according to recent scholarship, which sort of disrupted my typical sort of disruption and novelty model of meditation, the idea of Zen spontaneity in practice involves being able to completely, naturally, effortlessly, fully embody those protocols. Then, no matter, even if you don't feel it, you're acting like a Buddha, you're moving like a Buddha, you're ritually performing your inherent Buddha nature. So, this interpretation sort of chafes against either a modernist or a romantic interpretation of Zen, which is always looking towards epiphanies and novel insights. So, in this sense, contemplative practice does indeed, I think, uproot us from our homebound intuitions and default modes of perception, but it also fosters alternative ones, ones that may or may not yield what modern advocates of democratic institutions feel as emancipatory. And yet, I ultimately agree with Shannon that contemplative practices do offer something for those of us who want to hone our democratic sensibilities. And that's where the question Shannon asks, crucially, quote, what acts of creation must come after critiques? What is built after the disruption and unsettlement of the conventional categories that were once seen as natural, inevitable, and just the way things are? Part of the answer, I think, is that the novelty that emerges through the disruption of default intuitions in contemplative practices needs other structures to hold it, to meet it. Nothing is completely free form. We're always embedded in a context, and the work that meditation does depends on a broader context of ideas, intuitions, sensibilities that surround the practice. It matters whether you meditate in order to cultivate egalitarian sensibilities or meditate for serving the glory of the emperor and the nation. And in Buddhism, meditation and mindfulness, we remember, are just two parts of an eightfold path that was a comprehensive restructuring of one's entire being in the world. So, so now thinking a little bit further along with Shannon on democracy, again, the emphasis in the book is on disrupting default modes of perception, leading to these kind of democratic moments. And one question I have, inspired by the stark reality of the present political moment, is again, it's very parallel to the question I'm asking about meditation. How confident can we be that the disruption of default modes of perceiving and thinking naturally incline us to democratic moments rather than the opposite? Shannon notes that our default modes are governed by pernicious ideologies like white supremacy, patriarchy, misogyny, racism, and so on. And that democratic moments might arise when we might see the opposite of all those. In I guess I'll go to another quote that jumped out at me on 97. Jolted and jarred by radically democratic moments, we may suddenly see the ways that capitalism, for example, creates systems of value that are not natural and inevitable, but are the products of power and politics. We may perceive how capitalism and late modern neoliberalism create a system of value tied to profit and class, and how that system hierarchically ranks people, practices, and places. We may become attentive to how unconsciously we dismiss some people, pay attention to others, ignoring some, courting others, and we may see how this connects to a way of ranking people based on their place within a class hierarchy. Or we may newly understand how capitalism and class anxieties build certain habits and norms into people, build certain imperatives into us that fuel our days and shape our lives. So, all of that, I think, are things that certainly through contemplative practices we might come to see clearer. But as we all know, we're living in a rather dark time. So there's also the possibility that we may not come to see those, and we may come to see something very different. Today, we have to reckon with the fact that many are having a kind of awakening that the system they are living in has failed them. And rather than demanding more democracy, they put their faith in a fiercely anti-democratic strongman. Perhaps in an alternative universe, we're all sitting here breathing a satisfied sigh of relief, having gotten past a jarring anti-democratic aberration and getting back to the business of improving on the ordinary crappiness of our imperfect institutions, our corporate capitalism, the varieties of bigotry, economic inequality, and so on. But here we are in our timeline, where, at least in the US, Buddhism's three poisons of greed, hatred, and ignorance are official policy. And here's the thing, it came about through the unsettling of norms, disruption of default modes of perception and thinking, and so on. And many felt it as emancipatory, as a sense of liberation, a subversion, a kind of subversive freedom of transgression against what was experienced as stifling norms, suffocating etiquette, condescension, and so on. It's been experienced as an emancipatory anti-democratic moment. Before this rupture, politically left-leaning intellectuals, artists, etc., may have had too simplified a picture of a stultifying socio-political structure characterized mainly by misogyny, racism, inequality, rapacious capitalism, and in contrast, a better, more egalitarian, democratic, and humane order was waiting to bloom with a bit of fertilizing, tilling, and disruption. That's what would emerge out of the disruption of norms, of the shaking of default modes of perception. But what we've come to see now is that some crucial aspects of democratic life, too, were marbled through the system all along, kept it functioning, however imperfect. Perhaps more than we might have realized a decade ago or even a few months ago, many of our default modes of thought and perception also include a sense of fairness and justice, a desire for equal rights, a desire for greater economic equality, and that those are a part of the complex and contradictory ideascape and political institutions of the modern European American milieu. We might not have recognized what a central role these things were playing in our private and public lives until they came under such brazen assault. It was always a rickety boat, especially prone to flooding the lower decks, but it floated, and lots of good anonymous folks were busily maintaining the engines and patching the holes. Democracy has never been an all or nothing proposition. Sometimes it bursts forth dramatically in revolutions or epiphanies. Sometimes it's stuffing Social Security checks into envelopes or taking turns at the four-way stop. Autonomy and subordination, freedom and domination, culture and counterculture are often so knotted together that we may not notice the democratic threads that we took for granted until they began to unravel. In the prescient title of a book that Shannon cites, Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. So, how do we help foster the emergence of democratic moments, norms, sensibilities, rather than anti-democratic ones in this at the site of rupture, so to speak? The only way I know is to have robust ideas, habits of thought, ways of feeling and being with each other already ready to hand, accessible, in place. They don't emerge from meditation sui generis. And that's what Shannon's book, I think, offers us, how to bring contemplative practices together with democratic sensibilities, how to create what she calls a feedback loop between meditation itself and the ways of being that we want to bring about. It means having good ideas and compassionate ethics on the receiving end of unsettling. As Shannon points out in a variety of ways, the relationship between contemplative practice and democracy needs to be cultivated. It's not a given. So thanks again for writing this very heartfelt book. It's a wonderful contribution. And I guess, you know, my last question is just, have you rethought anything significant since this book on democracy came out at this profoundly anti-democratic moment in our history? Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. So Shannon, I'm going to hand it over to you now to respond to Sokthan and David's comments, and then also if there's anything else you want to say about the authorship of this wonderful book.
Thank you. Thank you, David, so much. And thank you, Sokthan. It's really just gratifying. And you were both in my head in different ways, I think, as I was working on different parts of this book. And I'm really glad, Sokthan, that you shined a spotlight on the Anzaldua parts of the book. And David, the questions that you ask are really the questions that animated the project from the start, right? And part of it was, I want to say a couple things about democracy, and then I'll answer some of the thoughts that came up in the talk. But part of how this project first came to, fruition, or the first idea, was I was reading a lot of radical democratic theory, as I do as a critical theorist, and reading, Theodor Adorno and Jacques Rancière especially, and noticing. So I was reading that, like, in my day job. And then I was also reading, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and Shunryu Suzuki, and all of this kind of, mostly Zen literatures. And I really noticed similarities, right? In sort of this, the politics of aesthetics, I would say. And some of this resonates with Anita's interests as well, and we'll talk about that later. But this idea that how we perceive the world is politically significant, and it sort of, it shapes how we behave in the world. And so I noticed similarities between how these radical democratic theorists talked about democracy as a moment and in terms of aesthetics. And I noticed resonances between how Zen modernists talked about the practice of meditation. And I don't know when I don't remember the timeline, right? It was a while ago, but at some point in this all, I read David's book, and I was like, oh, then this is why, obviously, right? This is why I'm noticing these resonances, is because these are thinkers that are all kind of working within the larger framework of Buddhist modernism, and they're responding to the life world of modernity in different ways. So on the one hand, I see, like, some of the chapters of the book, the chapter on Rancière and the chapter on Adorno, are sort of like proving your point, David, with specific interrogations of specific texts, right? To sort of highlight those resonances. But that also wasn't enough, right? Because parsing out the kind of connections between radical democratic theory and Buddhist modernist theory, that really didn't answer the questions that I wanted to ask, which is, what do ordinary people think about their practices, right? And so I really wanted to write a book that was more democratic, because Adorno and Rancière and the people I usually write about are not known for their accessibility, right? And they're not known for writing in a kind of democratic register. And so that was really what I wanted to do, like, to see what people in their practice on the ground, how they thought that their meditative practices, their contemplative practices, shaped their political being in the world, kind of broadly understood. And that was also really shaped by my pessimism that there was anything inherently democratic about meditative practices, right? And I said it earlier, but I think the first time I met you, David, at the very first conference that we organized, you said out loud something that you've also written, which is that meditation is a sponge and it takes the shape of its container, right? It sort of, expands to fill the shape of the container. And so thinking about that really got me to realize that I think if you're going to take contemplative practices in a democratic direction, they need a container that's also trying to do that, right? And that has kind of resonant goals. And so that's part of why the case study of the Circle School became part of the book. It wasn't initially part of my original plan, but asking these questions of how and talking to ordinary people led me in this more qualitative research connection. And Farah is here and Farah was like part of my inspiration as a political theorist, that like we can do qualitative research, like we can interview people, we can do these things, we can be social scientists too, not just like, you know, theorists. And but part of the other part of the conversation that's really, really central to the whole approach of the book that hasn't been mentioned, although it's come up in the language, is David said a number of times, like, we might, it can, we might, it can. This is a book that's shaped by a method called the politics of possibility. So I was not trying to show in a deterministic kind of way contemplative practices lead to democracy. I don't think they do inherently. I think there are resonances that they both have that can kind of be cultivated if the container also kind of has that goal, right? And so this idea of a politics of possibility was another way that I really wanted to get outside of the disenchanting mindset that characterizes so much of my life as a critical theorist. And Anita knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? Because that's part of what Anita's book is about. And Anita and I share that very similar kind of critical theory lineage. But we are skeptical and relentlessly disenchanting as critical theorists. And I wanted to explore growth and nurturance and possibility. There's a quote from the two authors that write together under the pseudonym J.K. Gibson Graham, and this is always in my mind, and it was really in my mind when I was writing this book. If we want other worlds, how do we make ourselves a condition of possibility for their emergence? And Gibson Graham also says, what if we believed that the goal of theory was not only to extend and deepen knowledge by confirming what we already know, but the world is full of cruelty, misery, and loss, a place of domination and systematic oppression. Like, you know, proving those things is usually kind of the mainstay of what I do as a critical theorist. But J.K. Gibson Graham asks, what if we also asked theory to do something else, to help us see openings, to help us find happiness, to provide a space of freedom and possibility? So that's their method of this ontology of a politics of possibility. And they see their role as theorists as to enable and nurture these inchoate openings. So it really does have to do with like growing things, right? And many, many times throughout the book, I say contemplative practices can do this. And that's the language. They might do this. There's possibility. They could grow into this. But it was a book that was really focused on nurturing little possibilities and helping them grow into bigger things. And I don't think it's incidental that I wrote this book during my son's lifetime. This is the first book I wrote as a mother. And I really think that like, I was like, I've had enough of disenchanting critique. Let's talk about growth and nurturance and possibility and, you know, how we take little things and help them grow into big things. That was on my mind. And I think that's really the heart of what the book is about. It's about showing what can happen if you have a container, right, that has contemplative practices that are sort of married to this democratic work. And the Circle School Cooperative allowed me to explore those possibilities and what could happen, right? Without any certainty that it will. I don't think it's certainly not automatic, and it's certainly not deterministic or anything like that, but it's a possibility, right? That can sort of grow. And it resonated in how ordinary people talked about their practice, right? It sort of, the language, some of the things that I suspected as a theorist came out in people's ordinary conversation, you know, that they were kind of becoming who they were in some sense. So I think that's the main thing I'll say. I want to make sure we have lots of time for conversation. So I can talk more about democracy and how I define it, because so much of the book is about really, like, I really want to make these connections between the etymological and historical meanings of democracy and what people say comes out of contemplative practice. Like, a lot of the book is just parsing. Democracy means this. Contemplative practices say it can do this. Look at the possible connection. Democracy is about this. Contemplative practices say they can do this. Look at the connection. So we could talk more about that, because it really is a book about what can grow if you create the right container for it, and what might happen, right? What will happen. The bigger question about, like, what all this means today, I don't know. Like, I really don't know. I'll say two things and we can talk about them more. And one of them is something I'd love to pick Farah's brain about, since she's here. Part of what's difficult when you study an institution like the Circle School, that you have a kind of some sense of ongoing connection with that thing that you studied, right? This was a community that I had participated in. I knew it from the inside. Obviously, I left that community. I wrote about it, but I still serve as a kind of advisor to some extent to the Circle School, right? I'm still in touch with it. And they've had really hard times. I think some of the book was written during the pandemic, and the final chapter talks about how difficult it has been for the Circle School to weather the pandemic and the kind of disengagement of the co-op, and how that has affected every part of the school's operation. And those problems have really intensified, I think. And to some extent, I think it sort of sadly proves the point I make in the book about the togetherness part of it, and the sharing of space, and the conscious cultivation of this community. I can talk more about that. But the other thing is, I feel like talking about containers, right, David? Like, the container that we have just unleashes all of this stuff now. We're not even trying to create a different kind of container, right? And so that's part of what I see happening. And I think that when I first started working on this book, I used to have to sort of work hard to convince people that there was a political economy of attention, and that attention mattered to politics. They'd be like, oh, what's that about? That doesn't make any sense. I'd be like, oh, it really does matter. And now it's like that case makes itself, right? Because what Trump has done is flood the zone and distract and really manipulate our attention, right? I mean, that is absolutely the strategy. So it shows how attention matters. But I also just think, we're not even trying to create a democratic container anymore. And, as a nation, like, that's not even on the agenda. So I don't know, help me think it through together. I mean, I think I continue to draw, to the extent that I draw inspiration, it's from the little things that I see around me, and it's from small scale things, and it's micro, and it's about that kind of lower level possibility that can be nurtured and cultivated. So in some sense, this nurturing of possibility is more important today than ever. But we nationally, at least, we're not trying to create those containers. So it's maybe even more important to try to, create them in our own small spaces. Let's talk about everything together now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shannon. So maybe before opening it up to the broader audience, maybe just allow Sokthan and David some time to, if you have any sort of responses to Shannon's thoughts, just a little bit of conversation amongst the panelists, if there is any things arising for any of you.
Actually, I would like to hear about what happened with the Circle School, because, it was, like you said, you didn't romanticize it, but you did sort of give me a glimmer of hope that this could happen.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I think the circle school weathered the pandemic pretty well. And in fact, the fact that it was a cooperative that was, not tethered to state public school policies in Texas helped. And it actually was I think more parents sent their kids to the school because of that. Like we were masking and vaccinating from the beginning. It was like, that's what we're doing immediately. But after the pandemic and during the pandemic, it was the cooperative that suffered, right? People were staying home. People were sending their kids to school. The school part of it was okay during the pandemic. The cooperative part of it really suffered because we had to hire more and more people to do things at the community. The community had to hire people to do things. So during the pandemic, there was plenty of money, right, to pay people to do things that the members of the community had previously done themselves. That's how the school weathered the pandemic. But that also meant that the parents didn't know each other as well, and that they weren't doing kind of this shared work of the school. So it has led to a lot more difficulty generating consensus, right? People at this school, they just don't know each other to the same extent, and there's been more turnover, and so the culture is not known as practically to the people at the school. So it's in a kind of moment of rebuilding, I think, right now. But I say it's sort of like the pandemic experience affirmed that the two halves of the school have to be in harmony with each other, right? The sort of curricular part that's about contemplative practices really does shape and inform the democratic cooperative part. And they both have to be kind of like, they both have to be in sync with each other a little bit. And Farah, my question was, I don't know, it's been so, my question was, I mean, I know you've done this too, but when I wrote about the circle school and when I studied the circle school, I was doing work as a scholar with a community that I had also participated in, right? And so there was participant observation research from someone who was kind of at one point inside the community and knew it from the inside. And then you sort of write your book. And like David said, I'm the only one without a copy of my book today. You're all like citing page numbers. I'm like, I don't even have a copy here. Like, who even cares about that book? It's like, it's forgotten. It's in my office. I don't even know where it is. Like, I don't even have a copy. But you sort of write this book and it freezes something and as a moment in time, but I know what's happening at the circle school today, and like the story continues, right? And the possibilities I allude to, they're there, but so are like the struggles. So I don't know, Farah, it's really a question about the afterlife of doing that kind of research, right? I think that's what I know you're still involved with the, the communities that you also researched. And so there's this weird thing of how to handle the afterlife. Part of it is like, I don't want to know about the circle school's problems because like in my head, I wrote about you in my book and that's the real thing. And let's just stop. Now you're done. You can't exist anymore in all your messy complexity, right? I don't know that. That was my thought that was what I thought you might also weigh in on, Farah, because I know it's probably something you've dealt with to some extent.
Yeah, Farah, take it away.
Thanks. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. I apologize. My internet is behaving oddly today. So I apologize for the disembodied voice. Thank you so much, first of all, Shannon, for writing this amazing book, which I also recall sort of hearing about as it was taking shape and then watching you develop it and refine it. And now, to have it be out in the world is just tremendous. So big gratitude to you, and gratitude, of course, to Sokthan and David for your really thought-provoking and amazing comments. This conversation, as I think I said in the chat, it's just so needed right now. You know, even if we weren't talking about Shannon's amazing book, I'm just happy we're together. And
Yeah.
then like talking about Shannon's amazing book is like the cherry. But I just want to name and acknowledge how important it is for us to be together in this moment, in this space, right? For all the reasons that we've talked about. So just gratitude to everyone. Okay, so like the afterlife thing, man, that is a whole thing.
Yeah.
That is a whole thing. So interestingly, I'm actually not that involved anymore with the specific communities that I studied. Why is that? Because I've gone on to do a different kind of prison work, where I'm actually building a prison education BA program, which means that, you know, because of the finitude of my labor and resources and time and energy, I've had to step away from the kind of yoga and meditation work toward, frankly, to be frank, right? I mean, and this speaks a little bit to, I think, David, some of the things you raised in your, you know, questioning of like how inherent is the ability of meditation to, right, allow us to develop more democratic instincts. And I think that's a really great interrogation of a really important question. And I think I also say in my own work, right, that there's no necessary relationship between meditative practice and, right, progressive, radical, or democratic practice, as you rightly mentioned. So that actually was one of the reasons. And sorry, I'm not actually answering your question quite yet, Shannon. I'm sort of detouring a little bit, but I think it does all come together. That's actually one of the very reasons, to be perfectly honest, why I found myself gravitating more toward educational programs inside prisons than yoga and meditation programs necessarily. And the difference, I think, is that I wanted to do something that was much more explicitly political. And the only way that, not the only way, one of the main ways that we can raise political consciousness by encouraging critical inquiry is through higher education. And I find it actually much more, what's the word? Like liberating and possible to do the work of actually fostering critical inquiry through educational programs rather than through yoga and meditation programs. Does that make sense? Because I think there's so much, as David and others have so rightly said, like when you teach yoga or not teach, that's the wrong word, I don't like that word, facilitate and offer yogic and meditative practices, they have to be married to a whole set of, right, political, critical and interrogatory practices and beliefs, which are not always intuitive when you're teaching yogic and meditative practice, if that makes any sense. And that's why I have come around to the position that actually, if you want to do the work that is emancipatory and critical and liberatory, you're better off doing it through spaces that allow for explicit, right, critical inquiry, with very specific and explicit, right, radical democratic underpinnings, which are not necessarily the case with yogic and meditative practice. Anyway, so that's like a long-winded way of saying I'm actually doing a very different kind of work now, which means that I'm not as much in touch with the communities that I studied. But here's the other thing I want to say about afterlives. In my own case, it was I found the afterlife to be very fraught. And the reason I found it to be fraught is that I ended up being far more critical of the communities I studied than they assumed I would be, right? Because when you, as everybody knows, right, when you make the kind of initial overture to these communities and say, hey, I want to do participant observation, they're all like, great, you're going to say good things about us. They don't say that, but they kind of assume that, right? They assume that you are in the game to say really great things about what is so, right, wonderfully liberatory about what they're doing. And then when you find out through your immersion that actually what they're doing is, you know, not nearly as critical or liberatory as you thought it was, and then you end up writing about it, right? Sort of your access to those communities can, right, be quite a bit more fraught. So anyway, all of which to say, I think afterlives are so complex. And I think it really depends on what you end up writing about the communities and what, you know, how much you feel like, as you say, you want to continue to invest so much of your energy in that work, right? And then there's like the inevitable fatigue that we all have after we've spent years, right, with a book, with the communities, and you're just like, Jesus Christ, I just want to be done. Anyway, sorry, I don't know that that's very generative,
No,
but
it is. Yeah.
all of which to say, just like a really big thank you to you, Shannon.
Thank you. Thank you, Farah. I hear what you're saying about the fraught afterlife, and for me, it wasn't because I was like, I mean, I was hopefully, you know, even-handed and wide-eyed in my treatment of the school, but it was positive, right? I think it was mostly like, these are these amazing possibilities. The position I'm in now is making sure, is reminding the school of those possibilities, and sort of like, I feel like my position is fraught now because I know, and I've thought deeply about this, this, and this, and I keep reminding them of this, this, and this in the capacity of like an advisor that I am to the school at this point. And, you know, they're in a different place right now, and it's difficult to be reminded of these ideals to some extent. Anyway, yeah. What you said about education too, though, makes me think of, I think the thing that the thing that has come to feel really helpful to me as a professor of political science these days is being really conscious about the container of the classroom. And so I really think about the container of the classroom as a space where I can try to you know, prefigure that democratic ideal that I'm working for, and create a community in the classroom through, you know, through some grounding practices that I do at the beginning of class and stuff like that. But also through reminding the students that we spend more time and I teach at a small liberal arts college, right? So my classes are 20 students, and I say to these 20 students at the beginning of the semester, look, guys, we are spending more time together this semester than I spend with anyone I'm not related to and living in the same house with. And it's really true. And they were like, oh my God, that is so true, right? And I'm like, we're going to be together for a long time, and we have to create this robust community where we can be ourselves with each other and try to work through, right, some of these difficult conversations. And I can't do much about the world beyond my classroom sometimes, but I can try to make that classroom a container for this democratic work. And I really, really consciously do that. And I think it's been I think students are hungry for it in a way, right? And I'll just remind, I teach in Texas, right? I mean, these are not students that all think about things the same way. So anyway, that is at least one place that I feel like I'm nurturing those possibilities today.
Great, thank you. So we have a bit of a lineup of questions. So I saw Olga first and then Anita. So Olga, if you'd like to ask your question.
Sounds like a really good book. One part that really stood out to me in this book is about the idea that people wear a social mask because of societal norms. And as an autistic person, those autistic people are burdened with having to wear a heavier social mask because they aren't accepted by society being their autistic self. So does this book address that problem that no other human rights movement addresses? Is the rights of neurodivergent people that are very overlooked? It sounded really interesting.
Yeah, thank you for that, Olga. I mean, I think one of the superpowers that you probably have is the ability to see the fact that they are social masks, right, in a way that is impossible to ignore. A lot of people, I think, don't realize that they're even wearing a mask, right? And that might be part of it. So I don't have anything specifically that I talk about with respect to neurodivergent people within the book, but I think I sometimes talk about this with students that have attention deficit disorders, and I'll say, you recognize the sort of political economies of attention because you can't not see that, right? A lot of people who are maybe more neurotypical in that regard, they don't realize, they don't think about their attention, and they don't think about how their attention works. And there's an insight, right, that comes from your lived experience, Olga, that is the sort of you cannot not see the social mask of it.
Thank you so much. And it's partly from my lived experience and time with friends. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Anita.
Thank you, Shannon, for this for your book, first of all, which I think just it's such a valuable resource to to us and to this community. And to me, I feel like it just says a lot of things, that it puts into words a lot of things that I have felt and thought about for a long time. So I feel so much resonance with what you do, and
Feel the
just
same way.
appreciating you.
I don't have my book, but I have yours.
But I wanted to, well, first of all, I wanted to just resonate with what Farah was saying about, well, just the power of education in terms of democracy, you know, and so that resonates a lot with what you've been expressing about how you create a container within your classroom. And I think that this group of people who's doing this work in higher education is a real testament to understanding that there's very specific things that we have to contribute to creating democratic spaces and innovating in that way, and using the practices that we know and that we are deeply immersed in this other way that is more oriented towards the political. And I think that your book provides us with the ways of talking about that, and being able to, you know, spread that word more. So I think I'm just really in appreciation of that. I wanted to also ask you a question about just, I guess that's a question about democracy and like polarization. And it's a question I've been thinking about in terms of, like, I think those of us who bring contemplative practices to various spaces, right, in a way that is oriented towards their radical democratic potential, as you discuss. I think, you know, one thing I think about a lot with this is that there's that, right? And then there's the fact that often we have a problem of like kind of preaching to the choir, you know, and not always, because you know, you talk about how you teach in Texas, and there are a lot of different perspectives in there. I teach in prisons, you know, like Farah does, and there's a lot of political variety and even, yeah, in a way, polarization in there. But I've just been thinking about a lot of debates and conversations that we've been having on the left recently, in the light of the fact that to some degree there's a conversation about how some people, you know, at the top in the Trump administration are really deploying certain kinds of almost sadistic techniques of power and their approach to legalities, let's say. And, you know, if we think about what's going on with like certainly immigrants' rights, you know, and so there's that. And I'm thinking of a talk that I heard Judith Butler give a few weeks ago that was talking about this really as a form of sadism. And I was thinking about that in terms of contemplative practice, and like how those of us who have so much belief in the capacity, the transformative capacity and kind of relational capacity of contemplative practices to create democratic potential, even if it's not, you know, it's not a given, as you've been saying. It's something that can emerge through a lot of messy work and very importantly, intention and intentional container creating, right? But on the other hand, I hear so much now that kind of seems to speak about a kind of unreachability of a huge part of our population. You know, if we think about in the US, certainly through like that meditative contemplative practices oriented towards democracy are not necessarily going to reach a lot of the audience that probably needs to be most reached, or that we need to speak to. So anyway, I hope that's clear, but I'm curious what you say about that.
Well, I mean, that, you know, that question about that was part of why not trying to police or judge the spaces where a lot of these contemplative practices were happening was really important to me, because mainstreaming some of these things, making them more accessible, democratizing them. I mean, I really disagree with the idea that that's always just McMindfulness, right? And that seems like a really problematically elite position to take, because for a lot of people, the yoga class at their, you know, at their gym or at their workplace, that, you know, that's as much as they're going to get. Or if their kid is getting some of these self-calming techniques in public school, I mean, I think that's how part of how we address this problem of unreachability, right, that you're talking about. And it also, this conversation makes me think of the self-love conversation from the previous panel. I mean, it's really striking to think that our cultural context in the US and in the West generally, maybe in 2025, is toxic to that degree that we have to work so actively to create, some sort of self-love, and other people in other places at other times would be like, what does that even mean? Self-hatred? I don't even have an understanding of that. So, I mean, I think that this is this is the part of me that really worries that, our culture has become really toxic in these ways that go deep. And I think about most of us on this call, many of us, maybe not all of us, but many of us are not, digital natives, right? I was born in 1976. The internet, email, all of these things, they came into my life when I was in college, right? I had I was like a junior in college, maybe, when like email was invented or something. And so, it's so different, I think, to kind of grow up in the landscape that a lot of people grow up in today. And I don't think we know the effects that that's having yet. That's really how I feel. I mean, then I'm like the middle-aged lady shaking my fist at the world. But I mean, I do feel like I worry for the future because I don't think we know the effects that some of the technologies that we use, how they affect our perception and our attention and our sense of self. I don't think we know what the effects fully are of those, but we're certainly living through some of the effects to some extent right now. That is in no way an answer to your question, Anita. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know this is in the classroom when I talk to my 18 to 22-year-olds and I give them a space to do these things. They have genuine conversations with each other across differences in a way that indicates to me they're thirsty to do it. And if they have the space, I think they embrace that. I've had really positive, like pretty uniformly positive experiences with trying to use contemplative practices in the classroom to create a community where people feel safe with each other to some extent that I don't think exists out there in their lives generally. Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, I see Farah's raised her hand. Take it away, Farah.
Oh, I don't want to talk too much. Is there somebody else that would like to go before me? I don't want to monopolize this
Well,
conversation.
actually, I guess with that in mind, we haven't heard from Jessica yet, and Jessica just raised her hand. So maybe we'll go to Jessica and then to Farah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Hi there. My name's Jessica Ziakin-Cook. I'm from UVic. I'm a PhD student working on postmodern art and the Bible. And I just came through invitation of the CSRS, and I'm thrilled to hear about your work. Each of you panelists and Shannon, I'm really excited. And so I wanted to hear about, does your book touch on the visual arts or the arts in general? And I bring this up to circle back to the access, inaccessibility conversation.
Yeah. I feel like the next panel is the one for you, Jessica. I feel like you need to stay on the call for Anita's the discussion of Anita's book. But I don't know if this is what you're getting at. But I mean, part of what led me to kind of not really talk about Buddhist meditative practices as the core of what the book is about, but to use the concept of contemplative practices more generally, is because I wanted to take into account a wider variety of attentional ecologies, so to speak, right? And especially embodied practices like making art, right? Not just looking at art, but making art. And thinking about and some of this has to do, this connects Sokthan to Ansel Dua, right? Like Adorno and Rancière do not have so many like creative solutions to the problems they create, right? I mean, not so much. But someone like Ansel Dua, she's an artist, right? And she's very much engaging in this creative work of spiritual activism that's not just tearing things down in a deconstructive way, but is trying to rebuild in an active kind of way. So that's part of why it started out, this book started out as like seated meditation, and you see my affinity for Zen throughout, right? Clearly, clearly Zen is that's the thing for me, to the extent that there is a thing, it's that, but it also just didn't always work for me, and it doesn't work for many people. But I think you can get to some of those same, experiences through other kinds of contemplative practices. And so that I wanted to widen the conversation in that way.
Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, Farah, please take it away.
You sure?
Yes.
Okay. No, seriously, I feel like I'm monopolizing the conversation. You know, Shannon, I've been thinking a lot about something that I think Sokthan referred to when she was commenting so beautifully on your also beautiful book, and that is the question of the policing of boundaries and categories and classifications, right?
Yeah.
Which is such an important theme that you raise, and rightly so. And it got me thinking, like, it's sort of like impossible, right, for us to have this conversation without referring back to the contemporary moment. So, like, apologies in advance, but
Yeah.
like we're all preoccupied
Yeah.
with that, right? So, and I started to think, like, that's kind of precisely what is at stake right now. Like the way in which power is being exerted right now in this incredibly, as you know, everyone has noted, profoundly anti-democratic way, is exactly by reifying and reviving and re-solidifying, right, boundaries, categories, and classifications that became too fluid and too loose for some people's likings. So what are we talking about? We're talking about boundaries of things like gender and sexuality, right? Who is a man? Who is a woman? These are the categories, people. Stop trying to be outside your category, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's why there's the attack on, right, trans rights, and it's broader than just trans rights. It's like we want to define two genders.
Yeah.
Or, you know, immigrants versus native, like who is the person who belongs here and who is the person who doesn't, right? Or who is the terrorist and who is the law-abiding person. And I can say this as somebody who is anticipating being targeted on my own university for my own vocal support of Palestinian rights. But like now suddenly, right, there's this need to create these boundaries, to reify the classifications, to reify the categories, right? And it has me thinking about to what extent, you know, democracy requires a kind of fluidity of boundaries,
Yeah.
right? That the
Yeah.
democratic instinct actually does require us to think in a more fluid, right, open-ended way about these categories and boundaries. And is it necessarily the case that the anti-democratic impulse sort of immediately goes along with the reification of those solid boundaries? It's like, stop taking our boundaries and classifications away from us. And if you do that, we will revert to, right, these anti-democratic impulses. Anyway, sorry, that's not very well formed, but yeah.
No, I mean that gives me a chance to talk about the book a little bit that David referred to as like best book title ever. Democracy May Not Exist, but we'll miss it when it's gone. I teach that book. It's a great book. And the Astra Taylor is the author, and she takes political theory and like really democratizes it too. Like she makes films and documentaries. She's a cool dude. But part of that book is about like tracing all of these inherent paradoxes that democracy is about, which is it's individual and it's collective. It requires you to think as an individual but work with others. It's we want some level of like mass opinion being represented, but we also recognize that expert opinion matters too. And anyway, there are all of these paradoxes that are not reconcilable. You cannot reconcile all of these paradoxes that are part of democracy, right? And the dilemmas of democracy. And you know, democracy may not exist, but we'll miss it when it's gone is another one. Democracy is what we want and it's impossible, right? And you can't like, Cornel West is interviewed in that book and he says you have to live in the tension between the slash, right? So you have it's individual and it's collective, and your place is living in the tension, in the slash between them. So democracy requires a level of comfort with uncertainty. And I would say that it requires a non-binary perspective on things, right? I mean, it requires a non-dualistic perspective that is both and, that it can be both individual and collective at the same time, which is, on some deep level, this is maybe one of the most explicit ways that I can connect insights that people usually associate, let's say, with Zen meditation, with the way people write about democracy, was that it's going to cultivate, a sort of a non-dualistic perspective. It might help cultivate a non-dualistic perspective and a level of comfort with living in this space of uncertainty. And that's, because Farah, all of this stuff you talk about and the desire to resolve those contradictions is based on fear, right? And a desire for security and James's work on this, it maybe comes down to fear of death, right? In some way, right? But it's fear. It's fear. And one of the people I interviewed really made that point really clearly and said, something that that we can talk about, like racism, and we can talk about sexism, but those are all the byproducts of something that's much more basic, which is fear, right, and insecurity, and maybe self-hatred. So yeah, the policing of boundaries, right, Farah? It's really that has to do with one of our default ways of perceiving things too.
Great. I might use my chair prerogative here and throw
Yeah.
a question.
I set you right up for that, didn't I?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to touch fear of death today. I'll take the day off. But I was perhaps avoiding my fear of death the other day and getting my dopamine hit scrolling social media in between tasks, and I saw this meme of how to fix your brain, and it showed someone sort of bereft in front of a computer screen, getting sort of dosed up. The way that we do with our screens and the algorithmic logic and all of that. That was one half of the meme. And then the other half was just someone reading a book. And so like the antidote is like just read a book, and this will help build up your attentional powers that have been lost by this sort of algorithmic fracking of all of our attention in the attentional economy. And so in the early part of your book, you talk about bringing together the two different wisdom traditions of political theory and contemplative practices. I was actually shook when I read that, because I of course it is, but I had never thought of political theory as a wisdom tradition. But I just wonder if you could speak maybe a little bit to the practice side of political theory, which in certain ways resonates with the earlier parts of the conversation of Farah's point about critical education, being and the reading that goes along with it, of being incredibly generative and important, and the practice of reading and the liberation that can come from the practice of reading. And so yeah, I wonder if you could just speak maybe to the practice side of the wisdom tradition of political theory or critical education more broadly.
Yeah. I mean, there's a quote that is never far from my mind when I'm thinking of political theory. And again, I will talk about this a little bit in the next panel, even relating to Farah's book. But Sheldon Wolin, great 20th century political theorist and teacher of many other amazing political theorists. Sheldon Wolin says that political theory is first and foremost a civic vocation, and only secondarily an academic vocation, right? That it's a civic vocation. So, I mean, the first thing I say to students is that you are political theorists. This is not a class about political theory where you're going to encounter other political theorists. You already are one, because political theory is about having ideas of how life should be and trying to put them into practice in your own everyday life. And that's what everybody from Plato to, Michael Sandel, however contemporary you think, Wendy Brown, that's what people are trying to do. They're trying to kind of create a better world and trying to approximate their ideals and their practices to some extent. And maybe they don't think maybe they haven't had a space to kind of think through what their ideals are yet. And the class is a space to do that work. Like, what are my theories about the world? What do I think is good and better? How I can put those into practice. And so it's a contemplative tradition, right? I mean, it is a wisdom tradition. I can't take credit for that, James, though, because that was Dean Mathowitz. And I footnote, in that part in the book, I footnote him because he was the one who described it that way to me. And I was similarly shook. I had never thought of what we do as a wisdom tradition that has a lineage. And Anne Glegg also talks about that. She talks about lineages in that kind of way, right? That I hadn't thought of. And it was really illuminating to realize that, yes, this is the tradition that I've been shaped by. So it's not, it's another way, what I was saying earlier, David's book, The Making of Buddhist Modernism, helped me see that who I am as a political theorist and as a critical theorist, which is really a fundamental part of who I am, right? I mean, it's not just my job, it's really how I sort of think about things and how I live in the world, that I didn't have to shut that part of myself off when I tried to engage in contemplative practices, but that they were both necessary. And maybe there was an uneasy tension sometimes, but that was also okay. That's really been profound for me, because someone put a comment in it earlier. I mean, I used to feel like I had to shut off parts of myself to some extent, right? If I would like sit down to meditate, I had to like, shh, that part, shh, we're not doing that right now. And that's not, didn't feel right somehow. So yeah, I think of political theory as a practice, right? I mean, it's not different in fundamental ways from political theory is a contemplative practice. Like,
yeah, oh, that's
yeah.
really helpful. Yeah, thank you. So we're almost at the end of our time here, but we do have enough space for one more question or comment. If something's percolating up for you and you'll have some fundamental regrets in your life, if you don't share it right now, then this is the time to unburden yourself of future regret.
I have one last comment to say. So this book that you're describing sounds a lot like what my friend Daisy talks to me about all the time. She and I are so close friends, and we have these conversations about this utopia, democratic world where everybody has the same opportunities, no matter what sex and size and shape they are, and the climate crisis doesn't exist, and school, college is free, stuff like that. And it's interesting how your book aligns with whole idea very closely. It's like she wrote it, you know.
This is the part of political theory that I think we often forget, which is that it's imaginative and it's creative, right? And some of the comments Jessica made touch at that as well. We tend to define political theory in terms of the deconstructive moments, not the creative moments, but they're also kind of always there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. That's a really nice place to end on, I think. And
if I could say one more thing,
please.
I just want to echo what everybody else said. I met many of you 10 years ago, right? As you mentioned at the beginning, James, and I met David, right? And I take credit for introducing David to this group. I was like, guys, I just read this amazing book. We got to get to know this guy, right? And I'm like, and then David came to our first mini conference. But this book really was written in a lot, as people have alluded to, it was really written in conversations with all of the people here. And Sokthan was one of the readers for the book early on, right? And Farah was an influence, and David was an influence, and James, and Anita was an influence, and this book really was a kind of getting outside of this authorial I that was in control of everything. And I really tried to write about that in the book as well. But it really, this book was written in conversation with this community. And I'm sure you all saw that, right? And you see that and you hear those things. And it was also a book that felt like it took a long time to write. So like, it was really, it's really gratifying to be able to celebrate it with this community in particular.
Wonderful.
Because
Well,
it was really anticlimactic by the time it was published. Like, who cares?
Well, yes, again, huge congratulations on this really amazing contribution. Such a beautiful book. So thank you so much. And so thank you, Shannon, for
Thank
sharing
you.
this with us. And then thank you so much to Sokthan and David for
Yes,
sharing
thank
their
you both.
generative feedback. It's always so helpful for those who haven't had a chance to engage too much with the book yet to hear some deep engagements from those who have spent a lot of time with the text. So yeah, thank you so much to everybody. And we are, in terms of, again, our larger program, going to take a little break right now. It's lunchtime on the West Coast. I know it's maybe afternoon snack time on the East Coast. So we'll take a half-hour break, and we'll be back at 12:30 Pacific, 3:30 Eastern to discuss Anita Chari's wonderful user's manual to Claire Fontaine. Can't wait for that. So we'll see you all back here shortly. And again, thank you so much for the wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Sokthan. It was really an honor.
See you in a bit, everyone. Thanks, Shannon. This was awesome.
Yeah, I'll see you in a little bit.
Okay.